Welcome to our weekly market review. As usual, I'm joined by Director George Glynos. George, thank you very much for joining me. So apparently there are two things that never say die, no matter how tough it gets, and that is Helen Ziller and the US economy. Helen Ziller threw in a hat again for the mayoral candidates for Joburg in next year's local elections, so that is a discussion all on its own. But the US economy has really been holding up, and it's we're seeing it. I think we've been calling for the past 2 years for some kind of downturn. There's been recessionary indicators going off everywhere, but of course, at the same time, you have a stock market that just is continuing to reach new heights. It's just breaking record after record, and it keeps on building and keeps on building. And it's within this space that the Federal Reserve last week made the call to make the first cut for 2025. It's unlikely to be their last. Was it the right call to make?
Yeah, it's hindsight's a perfect science. So in the months ahead, we'll be able to assess whether it was the right call or not. I think at this stage of the game, they have finally bought into this idea that there is a cyclical downturn unfolding. You got to ask yourself, okay, why now? What is it about now that gets them so excited? Because truthfully, if you had looked at the leading indicators, they've been negative for quite a while now. It's been at least a couple of years. If you have a look at the shape of the yield curve, it's been calling for a downturn that hasn't happened. If you have a look at our dollar liquidity index, been calling for a downturn which hasn't happened. If I have a look at the Fed's own recession indicators, it signals that a downturn should have happened that hasn't. The labor market, you look at the internals of the labor market, and it says that a downturn should have happened, and it hasn't. So clearly there's something about this business cycle which is a little different to previous cycles, and it's worth trying to just delve into what that might be. So on one hand, we do know that there was an awful lot of distortionary monetary policy applied to the economy through the pandemic. And we know that was quite a significant number, where they pumped in some $5 trillion worth of QE into that US economy in just the space of 18 months. The rest of the developed market would have collectively pumped in another 7 to 8 trillion on top of that. So you're talking about 12 to 13 trillion applied in a very, very short space of time. And so, that certainly had an effect on asset prices. We know that for sure. But you also know that things like excess savings have wound down. They're no longer there. You also know that there've been some layoffs and some layoffs that have been announced by many corporates around America. So that is something a little different. But at the same time, you've also had the deployment of AI, and that's taking place at an increasing rate. So if you look at the power of AI, it doubles every 6 months. But if you have a look at some of the deployment figures, we're now talking about, as a percent of respondents on a poll conducted by one of the universities in America, you're talking about figures between 15 and 20% of companies that were questioned are now actively deploying AI, and that figure is going to rise. In the past week, for example, we had Oracle that has just done a deal with OpenAI, and they're talking about an investment of $300 billion. That's just one company, and that $300 billion, just one deal, is exactly double the amount of investment into AI achieved throughout the whole of 2024. So to give that some perspective, 2025 is going to be at least double what we had in 2024, most likely multiples of that. And 2026 will be even more. So you do know that there is a lot of money that's being invested into this, and you do know that deployment of AI is now taking place at an increasing pace. Now, the reason why that's important is because we also know that some of the reasons for the layoffs has been the implementation of AI. And so what you could have is an environment where you have certain job losses or you have a loosening in the labor market, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have a reduction in profitability and productivity. So companies are able to more than offset what these employees were doing with machines that can work 24/7 at warp speed compared to what the employees were able to do, and therefore actually boost productivity, efficiencies, profitability, etc., which might at least go some of the way towards explaining what we're seeing at the moment. It's a little difficult to quantitatively give you an assessment of exactly what the impact of that will be, but we do know that it's going to play an increasing role going forward. And whether or not this is overhyped or not is, I guess, again, time will tell. But at least for the time being, it certainly is a big push towards improvement in productivity and efficiencies. And I think whilst we need to caution into not reading too much into it, we should also caution into just dismissing it as not something all that important, because I do think it's already starting to have an impact, and that impact is going to find expression in a whole lot of ways that we don't expect, primarily because, well, we don't have in these brains the capacity to be able to compete on a level field with what we're seeing in this technology.
Yeah, AI is distorting the labor market completely. And I think the spin off from that, we haven't even started to scratch the surface, the impact that that's going to have not only now, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years with skills development and such. But you mentioned, the distortion that happened to monetary policy during and post the COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw we saw this massive quantitative easing. And I know this is a theme that you so regularly talk to us about, but you know, with the quantitative easing in mind, it's not something that we can get away from. And as we spoke to a client on Friday, and I think the consensus is now is that there's going to be a downturn in the US economy or global economy even at some point or another. The question now becomes is how deep is that correction going to be? And whether or not, we could see another bout of quantitative easing to prop up and to ensure that we don't spiral into the likes of a depression.
Yeah. So the basic premise there is that these central banks, by virtue of what they've done over the past 15 years, have become more invested into propping up asset prices than ever before. So they have recognized that these asset prices have a material bearing on the size and health of bank balance sheets. And bank balance sheets are important because if you have strong bank balance sheets, you are able to generate a strong credit cycle, without which the opposite holds true. And the opposite is not something that any politician or any of the authorities in power at that particular point in time want to see, not on their watch. So what you have and what the market has come to term, I think quite appropriately, is the central bank put, which is a play on the options market, and the idea that if things happen too negatively in the financial markets, that the central banks will step in to try and prop some of that up, lest they suffer a big asset price correction, which then impedes their efforts to try and maintain employment at a high level and GDP growth at a particular level. So the downside to all of this is, of course, that it promotes, and this is where the moral hazard sits, is that it promotes the accumulation of debt, and that debt progressively over time becomes more and more unsustainable, which is obviously where this scenario eventually falls down. But these central banks are powerful, and they can continue down this road for quite a while still before they ultimately have to capitulate and do things differently. But for the time being, we do think that if there is a downturn, that the central banks will step in to prop things up, and that is the reason why people should guard against turning too pessimistic on equity markets, because we've seen this before. The minute things turn ugly, the central banks step in to lend some support, and that central bank put option is still very much in play, and I think is one of the reasons why any retreat, save for the retreat that we saw through the pandemic, might very well just be looked at as another buying opportunity for investors that didn't get in earlier.
To watch this space. On the political front, we know domestically, obviously, Joburg was the big focal point this week as the DA announced their mayoral candidate. We know the Madlaga Commission is continuing, but on the international front, the UN is their meeting in New York. Trump will also attend, obviously, as this comes amid the growing calls for recognizing a Palestinian state. I think Portugal was one of the late last night, also calling for that. Interesting developments happening there, but nothing too shaky yet. But we will keep an eye on that. George, thank you very much for your time, and we will chat again next week.
Thanks, Ilze-Marie.